Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be, and welcome to today's Conversation with Courageous Leaders, Asian American Experience in Local Government. We are so pleased that you've chosen to share this time with us today and are honored to have such a distinguished panel addressing us here. Just a few housekeeping items. Please be sure to keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. You are welcome to share your video at any time. Additionally, we encourage you to share thoughts, comments, or observations in the chat throughout the hour today, and we'll welcome your questions after the panelists have presented, either in the chat or sent privately to me. Those questions will then be presented to our panelists during the Q&A portion for their response. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to our moderator, Pat Martel. Pat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tammy, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today for this session concerning the Asian American experience in local government, a conversation with some very courageous leaders, as I know that you will learn as we proceed with the session. This compelling conversation comes at a time when coronavirus-related hate crimes against Asian Americans are on the rise across the country amid a surge in racist rhetoric directed towards China during the pandemic that we've experienced. In fact, today, the U.S. Senate is scheduled to vote on a bill authored by Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii and Representative Grace Meng of New York that aims to combat anti-Asian xenophobia and hate by making it easier for the federal government to track and address such hate crimes. And so with that background, today's conversation is going to help all of us to learn more about what our colleagues of Asian American background have experienced in their own journeys in local government, and hopefully to share with all of us their insights and providing advice to those who will be in leadership positions in the future about how to deal with some of the challenges that they have faced as Asian American managers. So without further delay, I want to introduce our panelists for today's session. First, we have Mona MIYASATO, who is the County Executive of Santa Barbara, California County. Mona's county employs about 4,200 employees in 21 departments with an operating budget of over $1 billion. She has over 25 years of experience in local government in both counties and cities. Her previous position was as the Chief Assistant County Administrator for the County of Marin here in California. And she also served as the Deputy City Manager for the City of Santa Monica. She's on the board of Cal ICMA and represents the counties on that board, and was one of the founding members, along with another one of our panelists today, Ed Shikata, of the INAPA, or what was at the time the California Network of Asian Public Administrators, which has now evolved into the International Network of Asian Public Administrators. So welcome, Mona, and thank you for joining us. We also have Charles Ozaki, who is a retired city manager and an ICMA senior advisor with the Colorado City and County Management Association. Charles spent 37 years in various roles leading up to assistant city and county manager and then city and county manager of Bloomfield, Colorado. He has worked with the National Civic League on the jury panel of the All-America City Awards for several years, and has been involved in other non-governmental organizations in the Denver area. Welcome, Charles. And then we also have Ed Shikata, who is a member of the ICMA Executive Board representing the West Coast region. He is also, in his spare time, the city manager of Palo Alto. And Ed's laughing when I say that because he spends the majority of his life in the city. He's also the interim president of the International Network of Asian Public Administrators. As I mentioned, he was a co-founder. In addition to serving as city manager of Palo Alto, when he first arrived in Palo Alto, he served as assistant city manager and the public utilities director or general manager. Formerly the city manager of San Jose, where he spent several years in increasingly senior positions, and also serving with the city of Long Beach early in his career as a engineer and director of public works, as well as the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. So as you can see, all of our panelists have a broad range of experiences in different locations. And so all of that, I hope you will learn, as I have in talking with them, has contributed to their insights and their experience. So I'd like for each of you, and we're going to start with Mona, to talk about your personal history as an Asian American and what influence, if any, it's had on your career paths in local government for you or in community activism and academia for some of our other panelists. So Mona, you want to start off with that question?
Sure, Pat. Thank you for having me here. But first, before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that your panel of city managers are unrepresented of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. We are all have Japanese surnames. We're all Japanese American, and we are not representative of the whole group. I just want to make that clear, and we acknowledge that, and just for the audience to know that we did try to find a more diverse group, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But for me, I'm third generation Japanese American. My grandparents immigrated from Okinawa, Japan in the early 1900s, and my grandfather was a farm worker on a sugarcane plantation. And I say that because every Japanese American is touched by World War II and the internment. And my parents are from Hawaii, so they were not relocated. But my father's uncle still was, because he was a Japanese language teacher, and he still had to move because their family was near an airstrip and they were considered suspect. And so they had to actually move from their home. My father also served in the Korean War, so he was a vet, and he went to college on the GI Bill, which afforded him a nice career and afforded us a great middle-class upbringing. And I say all this because it demonstrated to me early in my life that government has an incredible power to disrupt and injure human life, but also a great ability to create opportunity and improve lives. I went to college to pursue a career in journalism, actually, but in my junior year, my life changed, my trajectory changed, and I heard about the Junior Institute for the Public Policy and International Affairs program. It was called APIM back then, and it's a group, it's a nonprofit to encourage underrepresented people into careers in public policy. And so I did that. And what was most meaningful for me wasn't necessarily the institute, but the people that were there and the other participants. And I learned a lot about other ethnic group and racial groups and their experience throughout the United States. So I went on to graduate school. My focus was on affordable housing and community development. So I knew that I wanted to come back and work in local communities and work for a local government. And I just want to say that as an Asian American woman, you know, and you'll hear more about these things, as a woman, there's all these different stereotypes of model minority, stereotypes about gender, about submissiveness, or a dragon lady. I wrote an op-ed about the otherness that we all face, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous, and any hyphenated American faces today. And that we're in this space today to try to combat that. And as local managers, I think it's great the work that ICMA is doing to try to combat that and give more education and tools for local managers. And I also want to acknowledge that the Chauvin trial yesterday, I think we can't go on this conversation and talk about race without acknowledging that. And what the president said, that this is just the beginning of addressing the systemic issue of race and racial hatred in our country. And so it's a good time to start if we haven't already started. But that's basically my journey and my passion of why I chose local government.
At this time, I would like to acknowledge that I skipped over one of our panelists because my screen didn't show her photograph and I went right over her. But I'd like to introduce Dr. Kathleen Yang Clayton, who is a clinical professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is the director of the Civic Partnerships and Department of Public Administration in the College of Urban Planning and Public Administration. She's also a research fellow with the Great Cities Institute. And while Kathleen is not a city manager, she brings great insights about the field of public administration and the role that we play in affecting the lives of Asian Americans across all various Asian backgrounds. She's worked prior to the University of Illinois, she worked with the Asian American Advancing Justice Project in Chicago, where she helped to pass landmark legislation expanding voting rights and strengthening election systems in Illinois. She's also been involved for several years working with cities on national initiatives that tie public administration and racial equity together. She's been working on the project that ICMA is in partnership with the Kettering Foundation and the National League of Cities to help bring a focus on the operationalization of racial equity practices in large public organizations. So with that, Kathleen, I'm so sorry, but will you please be our next respondent to the question about how your experience as an Asian American or Japanese American has affected the work that you do?
Sure. Thank you, Pat. And I'd be lying if I said I hadn't done that before myself, so no problems. Welcome, everyone. And I just wanted to echo what Mona was saying and give a big welcome to our South Asian, Southeast Asian brothers and sisters who have joined us as well. We kind of pulled this panel together a little bit at the last minute, and our commitment and our understanding is very much that we are a very diverse community. There is no such ethnicity as Asian American. So that's actually a really good way to think about, how we have to expand the dialogue and the faces that represent what being Asian American means in America. As for me, so I've had several careers, and this current one that I'm in, I mean, the real short story is, so I'm Korean American by origin. I was born in Korea, but my mom married my dad when I was really little, and we came to the US. And so I grew up in a mixed household. For most of my life, I didn't think twice about the model minority myth. I, grew up with a white dad and a Korean mom, and my Korean mom was very committed to me not speaking Korean and assimilating as rapidly as possible into American life. I made it almost straight through my PhD program, and there is when I started to really understand. I trained in sociology, like what my racial identity actually meant, and kind of weirdly enough, like as I was finishing my dissertation, I decided, wow, I really don't want to be an academic. So that might have disqualified me from actually getting my PhD, because people are like, you really don't have to study to the 23rd grade to do anything outside of academics. But I decided to take a position with an organization back then. It was called the Asian American Institute in Chicago. And when I joined, it was a really tiny shop, but they had gotten a lot of funding from, let's say, an angel investor. And we ended up doing a lot of work and affiliating with what is now called Asian Americans Advancing Justice. There's 5 affiliates. There's one in LA that we kind of call it our flagship or fathership, mothership. And then San Francisco, of course, Chicago, Atlanta, and DC. And you guys probably heard about some of the amazing work that Advancing Justice in Atlanta did in the runoff elections and just post the massacre that happened in Atlanta a little over a month ago. I also just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that we had a pretty momentous verdict that just dropped yesterday, and to acknowledge that there's a lot of opportunities that we have right now to lean into this moment, this very rare moment we have, where the arc of justice actually is leaning in the right direction. And so I really encourage all of us to take this moment to think about the way that we actually think about operationalizing our commitment to racial equity, and not just sitting back and hoping that we get another verdict like this, because that's not how this works. So anyhow, I joined Advancing Justice, and I come at my work in public administration both with a real deep commitment to public service on the inside and understanding very much the challenges that you all face working for municipalities or large agencies. The internal work environment is a very special one, I'll call it, for public administrators. But I also wear an advocacy hat, and I really care about the way advocates are kind of pointing us in the direction of justice and how we bring that into the internal environment of our organizations. Wait, you're on mute, Pat.
I'm sorry. Charles, so can you share your insights as someone who has worked many years in public administration, and you, like myself and others of our vintage, I'm sure, found it very difficult to find people that look like us when we started out in our careers, and you've shared that with us. So I'd appreciate it if you'd share it with those who are listening this morning. You need to unmute as well.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I also want to share my family story. So I'm a second generation American. My parents were first generation Americans, and they came to this country because of World War II. Unlike the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II and forced to move from the West Coast inward into the United States into concentration camps. My family was in Peru when World War II started. And along with a couple thousand other Japanese immigrants in South America, they were kidnapped by the United States government and brought to the United States during World War II and held as hostages. And most of them went to Crystal City, Texas, into a special camp for Japanese hostages. And they had both male heads of household and families living there. And so potentially they were going to be exchanged as prisoners during World War II. And so when my family came to the United States, their documents were taken from them, and then they were declared illegal aliens and then arrested and then taken to that camp where they stayed during the duration of the war. And then when the war ended, they had to go somewhere. And they were, because they were declared illegal aliens, they had to find a sponsor in order to stay in this country. And my family was fortunate enough to have a distant relative that lived in Denver who were able to sponsor them. But when they were released from camp, they came to Denver. And so a little bit different story for a Japanese family in America after World War II. But that story joined with the Japanese Americans after World War II in our family's circumstance in Denver. And when we came to Denver, there was nowhere to live except in a red line neighborhood. And so nobody would rent to Japanese or Japanese Americans after World War II, except in those neighborhoods. And so that's where I grew up, and all of my friends grew up, growing up in Denver and Colorado after the war. And I like to say that when I was in elementary school, I did not see a white student until 3rd grade when we went on a field trip to a white neighborhood, to a white school. And so that was kind of an interesting life experience. But ultimately, my family did move to the suburbs because my parents, my parents were entrepreneurs, and they owned a grocery store, and they owned a succeeding grocery stores, each time going up in scope. And so what I experienced was I was a stranger in a strange land when I went to the suburbs, because the suburb I moved to was all white. There was an Asian ahead of me in class and an Asian behind me in class. And so that's how I grew up, and graduated high school from that experience. And so I went on. An interesting thing about where my career began in government was I participated in youth and government days when I was in high school. And I also seemed to have an affinity for history and government study. And so I kind of took that into college. But when I was in college, I was not a very good student. I was kind of a rebel. My mother said, you know, you need to go to college and you need to get a job with a good company. Okay. And so, you know, that message from my family was, you need to assimilate. And assimilation was the only way to accomplish what my mother and my father wanted for me. And when I was in college, the only relevant course in terms of career in my course of study, which was political science, was public administration. And so I guess that kind of set me on my course after college. I was fortunate to get a scholarship after college through a HUD grant to the local Council of Governments. It was called Minorities in Urban Administration. And so I see some head shaking. So there might have been some folks who participated in that. Basically paid for my master's degree, but what the Regional Council of Government did was they placed me with a city manager's office in a suburb of Denver. And I'm forever grateful to the assistant to the city and county manager of Westminster, Alan Miller, who is the one who hired me as an intern in their office. And he mentored me. He shared a lot of insight with me about government, about how things worked, you know, what was the story behind the stories. And that was really helpful in getting me focused on becoming a city manager. The one thing I missed was in that job was working directly with mayors and city councils. And so I found another program, which was sponsored by the Department of Local Government, a state agency, that gave a grant to a couple of small towns in Western Colorado. And those towns hired me as a circuit riding city manager. And so there was my next step in my development as a city manager, was to be able to work with mayors and city councils. And I did that in 4 different towns in Western Colorado. And finally I got married and I had to come back to Denver. And a city manager I knew, George DeCero, who was the city manager of Broomfield, and who retired after 43 years as a city manager of Broomfield. Well, he hired me to be his assistant. And he was a great mentor over a long period of time. and he treated me like a partner, his partner in managing the city of Broomfield. And that's how I ended up, and really had a lot of great opportunities, a lot of challenges. One of the greatest ones was helping Broomfield, a city, become a county in Colorado. First and only one in 100 years in Colorado to do that. So that's kind of my story.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Charles. It tells us a lot more about your experience as a stranger in a strange land who became very familiar with the strange land that where you ended up. So appreciate those thoughts. So Ed Shikata, share with us what your experience is as a Japanese American man has been, and the influences that played in your decisions about a career path, because you didn't start out being a city manager. So how did that affect your ultimate career change?
Sure. Well, thanks, Pat. And first, let me just acknowledge my admiration for this panel. You all have just made some extraordinary comments, and it's really a privilege to be a part of this. Really just like to start by associating myself with earlier comments about the context of the conversation today, including the fact that we really don't represent the full spectrum of experiences of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and the broader community overall. But that said, I think we've got some amazing stories. So within that context, among the Asian American experience, I guess I'll be the extremist of the old timer. I'm actually a fourth generation American. My family immigrated to Hawaii before 1900. And so I grew up in Hawaii, an area, in an environment of majority minority culture, and as such, and one in which Japanese Americans play a major role in civic life, in government, and various sectors of society. So within that spectrum, or in that context, and in the spectrum of experiences that our panelists have shared, quite frankly, I represent privilege. I represent the privilege of not realizing the gifts that I had in that environment, and really have reflected on that recently, and just a tremendous awakening and realization of our own personal advantages that we experience over time. So that said, and to Pat's point, I left Hawaii, went to UCLA in urban planning school, and the quick thumbnail there is as an engineer, someone who had left Hawaii with an engineering degree, going to UCLA for urban planning, didn't realize that it was the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, and there were two buses in our orientation tour. There was the bus for the architects and the bus for the urban planners. The architects went to Bel Air, Beverly Hills, Malibu, see the gorgeous architecture of Los Angeles, and the urban planners went to Watts, Skid Row, Route 2, unfinished freeways, affordable housing projects, and the like, and really opened my eyes to the challenges coming from a perspective, again, of privilege and arrogance and believing I was out to change the world, to really get an exposure to the challenges of urban society. And quite frankly, it told me that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So the opportunities to get into city management opened up really after a partial career in transportation and public works, coming to San Jose to the city manager's office. And as Pat pointed out, spent 12 years there. Then, after getting dismissed from San Jose, an experience that many managers have had the pleasure of experiencing, I'm moving to Palo Alto. I had taken on that job on an interim basis as assistant city manager, and was really trying to assess what was important. And really, it was in that context, with a hat tip to Pat Martel in particular, and going to the 2015 ICMA annual conference in Seattle with a keynote speaker, Renee Myers, speaking about diversity and inclusion. And a quick, if I can, vignette about, imagine ICMA conference, the opening session, I believe it might have been with, it could be 2,000 people in the room, where Renee Myers asked people to self-identify by any particular demographic they wanted, men in the room, women in the room, African-American, Hispanic, and when she got to Asians, and asked each group in succession to stand. So again, in a room of maybe up to 2,000 people in the room, when she got to Asians, there were about, I want to say 10 people who stood up. And that experience kind of pointed out how few of us there were, and might have been following Charles around at that point during the conference, but others sharing with me how shocked they were at how few Asians there were in the room. And my response was, shocked? Why would you be shocked? I mean, it's obvious to all of the rest of us, but perhaps what was obvious to some is not obvious to others. So fast forward, got involved, and perhaps my key contribution to this conversation would be the involvement I've had and the privilege I've had to be involved with the organization now known as INAPA, the International Network of Asian Public Administrators, that has really opened my eyes and the opportunity to meet the next generation of managers, of the folks who are leading today, but will lead into the future. A few of who are here today. So maybe we can get into the particulars of that experience. But it really makes me tremendously optimistic about the future of this profession and the impact that we will have on our communities and across the nation.
Thank you for sharing that, Ed. So I want to move on and talk about, or ask each of you to share if there was a point in your life and or your career specifically that your identity as an Asian American, a Japanese American, a Korean American, or a stranger in a strange land, as Charles mentioned, subjected you to racial bias? And if yes, how so? And if not, do you feel that your racial, what is referred to as the invisibility of the Asian community, and the belief that somehow racism doesn't affect Asians the way it does other minority groups, contributed to your avoiding overt bias? And let's start with, let's go back to Mona.
Thanks, Pat. You know, when you say that, there's a couple of instances, and I don't know if there was one particular instance, but I'll give you a couple of instances. And it leads to the point of when I've talked about there's the blatant racism and then there's microaggressions. But the microaggressions build up, and not only are dangerous because of what they do, but what they do to the individual if you're not aware of them as the receiver of them. When I was this young professional, I got my first job in a city. I was so excited. You know, I'd gone to Harvard for my graduate work, and I'd been and done other work. And I got to the city, and I remember in my welcoming, the secretary of the city, I spoke to her. I'm really excited to be here. She said, "Wow, your English is really good. I'm surprised." Mm-hmm. And any Asian American Pacific Islander, probably on the mainland, has gotten that in some respect. And I was so deflated. Here I was, a 20-something-year-old person, full of energy. And I thought, wow, the first thing she saw was my ethnicity, and she made a judgment about that. Fast forward to where I am today. I'm the county executive officer. And when I, in my community, everyone is probably the most open community I've been in. We're 40% Latinx. And so there's a huge awareness, I think, compared to some other places I've been. But even then, I had a commissioner, a woman who's on a commission, and she, early in my tenure, she emailed me and said, would you want to be in a fashion show? We're doing a fashion show. I'd like you to be in a fashion show because there's a woman Asian designer, and we're looking for Asian women to be in this fashion show. And I just said, there's a whole lot of inappropriateness about that. But again, the moment to me was that no matter how many generations you've been here, no matter how educated you are, there are some in your community who are always going to see you first based on your ethnicity. And that's probably true of most people. But as managers, we strive to provide equal opportunity. We strive to live our ideals to help everybody. And the moment to me was when realizing that's not how everyone sees me. I know my values and I know this profession, but that's not how people are going to perceive me all the time. And that was a big awakening. And I have to say that probably happened in the last 8 years, understanding that. And then, and then just going through my career saying, is that perception people have and potential bias, is that affecting their relationship to me? And more than that, is it affecting me? Mm-hmm. And what I want to tell the younger people coming up in this is that will happen, and don't let it affect you. Know yourself well enough, and we'll talk about mentorship, but don't let it affect you and your own courage and your own ability to know who you are and what you want to do in this world.
So Kathleen, can you share with us in the work that you have undertaken on behalf of Asian Americans and the advocacy that you've had, have you actually confronted the racial bias that you have worked so hard to fight?
Yeah, I mean, on a individual level, yeah, I mean, the quick story I can share is I remember I was probably like 8 or 9, and my dad was a big fan of taking us to national parks. And we had gone to Mount Rushmore, which was actually a pretty cool experience, believe it or not. Like I was like being stuck in a car. I'm an only child, so being stuck in a car with my parents was like the last thing I wanted to do. But I was going from, the overlook to the bathroom by myself. And, there was this nice older white couple who were like walking kind of next to me. And, they kept on looking at me, and I was like, what? Right. I was just like walking to the bathroom. And so, the lady was like, oh, it's, welcome to the US. Where are you from? And I was like, Chicago. And they were like, oh, and I was like, yeah, what? Thank you. And I mean, again, I kind of laugh about that now, but, the reality is that, I mean, especially after Atlanta, it really landed on me very hard. If you do this work, if you care about voting rights, if you care about public service, and especially given now, like I can see my face as I'm talking, and usually I don't. Right? Usually I'm just Kathleen talking with people, and I don't think about what my phenotype is. I'm talking about immigrant rights or voting rights and things like that. And, after Atlanta, it really was one of the first times where I genuinely felt like, like I really didn't belong, that you could easily just get targeted because you present a certain way. If you keep your mouth shut, then you can just be, people can assume that, you're not from here. And of course, for a lot of you who don't know, there's, this kind of perpetual foreigner myth. And I just posted something about Margaret Chin's work, where she was talking about, why don't Asian Americans get promoted as quickly, or like, what are some of the barriers? And, honestly, one of them she discovered, and is true, just resonated with me, is trust. Given the cross currents of damaging narratives about the loyalties of Muslim Americans or Asian Americans, or, what's been said about our current pandemic and its origins, that stuff sinks in, and it sinks in deep. And there's also this idea that you can't connect with me because I present as Asian versus presenting as American. And so there are the cultural barriers that are presumed and all these things. And as you guys know, as managers and top leaders, trust is an extremely important part of, how you operate. It can't just all be rules and procedures and policies. So that really is a barrier. And the other part of this for my work is, as an institutional scholar, like most of my work actually focuses on institutionalized racism within large public organizations. So, I mean, honestly, a lot of my work does not deal with individual level implicit bias. I mean, it's important work, that's cool. But I find that, when you really think about diversity. We have diversity in our leadership and C-suites and, up at top. If you look at Chicago Public Schools, if you look at large public organizations, it's diverse, and yet we seem to continue to reproduce really terrible policies that are extremely racist. I mean, if you look at our neighborhood schools, if you look at this, and the people who are at the top in leadership positions look more like, the people who have their screens on right now. I mean, it's not just one ethnic group or one community that is perpetrating this. So my research really does focus, and I encourage you guys to think about, what does institutionalized racism look like within your organizations, and how can you pull teams together to actually work together to dismantling, as well as creating more inclusive policies and programs on the inside.
Thank you for that. So, Ed, what about you? You have worked in your career in very diverse areas in California, which also has a very high concentration of Asian Americans of all different ethnic backgrounds. But have you yourself in your work experience been subjected to any kind of racial bias that affected you on the job?
Well, so maybe I'll give you two quick hit examples, which may not be what you'd expect, but I think are notable nonetheless. The first would be soon after I got to Palo Alto, I took over the role of general manager of utilities, as you mentioned, and I succeeded an Asian woman that was in that director's role. And so at one of the first all staff meetings that I had with the folks in the utilities department, had normal kind of meet and greet, say hello to everyone, fine. And then after the meeting, a field technician came up to me and said, "Hey, so are you related?" And I said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "Are you related?" And just, this is irrelevant, but he may have been Hispanic, or I don't recall, but that piece doesn't matter. But in any case, he said to the former director, and first my reaction was total awkwardness, and I said, well, first off, she's Chinese and I'm Japanese, so no. It turns out I was wrong anyway, but I had made it my own assumption based on her last name. But that said, that struck me as wrong at so many levels that a frontline worker would think, one, that it was possible, and two, that would be okay. That for me, I actually found it profoundly sad to think about, but also really kind of demonstrated how people assume things are okay. When, from a leadership perspective, like I said, there's no way that could even be close to okay for me to be related to her, or much less for that to even be considered something that a line staffer might think is acceptable. So, again, the opportunities to demonstrate leadership, a little embarrassing at multiple levels, but nonetheless, also a lesson at multiple levels. The other one I would share, just as a 5'0" leader, is podiums. And so I am constantly given opportunities to speak. Thankfully, in the COVID environment, this hasn't been an issue, but pre-COVID, every time I have to go to a podium, I either need a stool or I avoid the podium because it's so uncomfortable. Because sometimes they'll see my eyes over the front of the podium, and so racism, probably not. Bias, definitely. Assumptions, for sure. But running into those kind of invisible barriers for me, and I've harken back on Mona's comment about microaggressions, have certainly been a daily occurrence, and one that, you know, I think I laugh about, but are nonetheless really important, and important for us to be aware of as leaders who are looking for opportunities to open the door and invite others to take leadership roles, but also to recognize that those do exist and they do require our attention to overcome. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Charles, share with us any of your thoughts about racial or ethnic bias that you have experienced personally throughout your career. You'll have to unmute, Charles.
I have to go all the way back to high school. And kind of the, you know, going back to this being different and how do I fit in? And so what I remember most vividly was that I became a jock in junior high. And so if you're a jock, then your persona changes a little bit. And so when I got into high school, you know, I was no longer a jock, but that persona went with me into high school. And so I think, you know, I fell between a jock and a nerd, okay, in high school. And so, you know, maybe there was some slight reference to race, and but you know, I was the only one, so you know, it wasn't like there was a comparison. You know, you're one of those. Well, I was the only person, so I guess I avoided a lot of things that others may have, you know, experienced outright prejudice. But, you know, I always carried it with me that I was different, and always kept that in mind. When I went on to my work, it was the same situation. I was the Asian manager. So if somebody and when you're living in a small town area, you know, the word gets around very quickly. And so when people saw me, then they already knew who I was and what I did. And so, you know, that was probably pretty good. It continued this new persona, right, of the professional manager who came to work from out of town. And so I think that, you know, that worked in my favor, I believe, in most cases, and maybe in every case, as I went through my career. And so it's something maybe to keep in mind. You need to be aware of that. You need to be understanding, you know, how people think about, might be thinking about you. And then you need to go on that basis. Either correct misperceptions, or in my case, use perceptions in some cases. I do believe that the reverse, and I can think of one instance where the fact that I was a minority in my position and as assistant manager, I became a person who was approachable by other minorities, and who were far and few between, who felt, and I remember one case, who felt uncomfortable about an interaction with the city. And this person, they had a code violation. And there was a real concern about, you know, was it based upon prejudice? And the one thing that I could do was say, no, that's not our policy, okay? But it sure made me aware of the potential for that, and made me want to be on the lookout for that. going forward. So I think that's kind of the experiences, that I've had.
Thank you. Pat, just a quick note. We are just about 10 minutes before the close of our time today. I have received one question from the audience, so I'll wait your word when we can officially open up for Q&A.
Okay, I have one last question that I'd like to ask of the group, and that is, what advice would you share with the next generation of Asian American local government professionals about how to navigate through the uncertain times that we're facing today and that I'm certain they will continue to face in the future? And how can they promote inter-community and interracial dialogue to develop more equitable long-term solutions to bring people together, to better serve our colleagues within the profession as well as those we serve in our communities? So Mona, why don't you start us off?
Two things come to mind, and one is how do you navigate, and one is, I think what's really important is mentorship and connection. I think Kathleen said that as well, and that's why, and I'm going to do a plug for INAPA, because there is this diaspora basically of Asian American Pacific Islanders, and there's no, as Kathleen said, there's no Asian American one identity, so it's hard for people to come together. But we have provided this space that Ed and everyone in INAPA has done, and many generations have tried. I mean, so it's great that is a space. So for their connection, especially now to have that conversation. And the second thing is I want to echo Ed and just how grateful I am to have this opportunity and be part of this panel, because one thing, if you've noticed, everyone has done is express vulnerability. And the path to courage is founded on being vulnerable to express yourself, express your story. And I know people have said, how do you manage your ethnic identity with being a manager and this fairness and what your perception? And I don't think there has to be, they're not opposed to each other, and because we're integrated as human beings. But the first step is being vulnerable to describe that, talk about that. It's part of your own evolution. And so those are the two things that would come to mind.
Ed, what about you? What are your thoughts for the next generation?
Okay, lightning round would just be opportunities are in front of us, so take advantage of them. They as I say, are present, but at the same time, don't knock your head against the wall. If you're not getting traction where you are, find somewhere that you are appreciated. I do believe that there are multiple areas that folks can pursue. Again, plug for INAPA. I have met some amazing people, and I'll say young people or people who are rising in their career. And so using the networks, building your networks to know where those opportunities are, I'm sure it's right around the corner. And it does take time though. So need to stick with this amazing profession and the path of public service that we've all taken. There are ups and there are downs for sure. But by building your network, they'll help you weather those. Thanks.
So Tammy, I want to get to that question. So you want to provide it to the panel?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it kind of piggybacks nicely on this question that you've asked as your final for them. The question is to the panelists, what is your experience navigating being an advocate and a public administrator? And how has that balance between advocacy and the workplace been informed by being Asian American?
So Charles, you want to start off?
Yeah, restate the last part of what you said.
Sure. The question, let me get back to it, bear with me. So the last part of the question concerned how the balance between advocacy and the workplace has been informed by your being Asian American.
Okay. Yeah. The information is the experience, and experience not just myself, but others like me. And when I say others like me is Asian Americans, and also others like me who are diverse. And so the whole spectrum of diverse people. You know, we have the ceiling above us that is very difficult to break through. And the holders, the people that control the ceiling, the gatekeepers, you know, I'm looking at some of them, they're city managers. And you know, I was thinking of the previous question, what would I say to young people who want to move up and forward in this field? My advice is reach out to local government managers and assistant managers and engage in a discussion about what was their path to where and how did they get to where they got to, all right? And then how do you apply that to yourself? But, you know, that engagement has to be made available by the gatekeeper, by the managers and assistant managers who are predominantly white in this, you know, in our country. And so they need to have a sense of a need to share. And, you know, why would they do that? I think it's this idea of service to the community. And the one key thing about service to the community is, who is the community? The community is becoming much more diverse every day, including the far corners of the country. And so I think that's the message that I think needs to get out there, and that understanding about diverse community needs to be served. How do you do that? Well, you do it with diverse people in your organization, and it's including at the highest levels of the organization. So I just think that that kind of vision of moving forward, you know, needs to continue to be nurtured, and a deeper understanding needs to be achieved by the gatekeepers.
So Kathleen, can you respond to the question that was posed, and from the perspective of someone who works with larger public organizations and institutionalized racism on a lot of different levels, how can you offer some hope for those who are coming next, who will be working in those kinds of organizations, about how they can deal with the topics that we've been talking about this morning, and offer them some advice?
Sure. Okay. I'll do that in 2 minutes or less. Real quickly, I mean, given that I connect with a lot of MPA students and MPPs as well, and, you know, I think that the younger generations in our communities have this figured out, right? They get this already. And the challenge for us, and I think Malaya Abed posted, like, how come I have never heard of this in my MPA program? Yes, I agree. I'm working on that, Malaya. Honestly, I'm working on that right now. But really, there's internal issues that we have to deal with as a discipline and a field of practice, that there is a lot of tension between what we want to claim as our role as technical experts and administrative process defenders versus all that democracy and advocacy stuff that gets in the way. It's a tension. It's a real tension, and it runs across all of our academic research, our training and MPA programs, as well as what we do in practice. So I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think if we call it out and we also engage our younger colleagues to show us the way, because they are experiencing this, as well as connecting with people who are in leadership positions, but really creating space for younger colleagues to just give us more. I mean, right now we're in a period of disruption. We should embrace that. And I know that sounds crazy because we're all administrators, but we gotta figure out how we create those spaces so that we can innovate and test and actually accept that there are things that we don't know and that we're not doing well. And that if we embrace more inclusion, if we actually try out different things instead of, you know, the same thing over and over again, we might find that there's better policies and programs that pop out the other end for all of our communities in our municipal roles or administrative roles everywhere.
Thank you for those final comments. I want to thank all of the panelists, Ed Shikata, Mona MIYASATO, Charles Ozaki, Kathleen Yang Clayton, for sharing all of your insights and your personal experiences and personal history. I know that this kind of conversation is so invaluable to all of us, gaining a better understanding of some of the issues that we're confronting in our communities today. I also want to put in a final plug for something that both Mona and Ed mentioned about INAPA and the importance of being engaged, particularly if you are a person of color and come from a minority community. The ability to engage with others in an affinity group like INAPA or the Local Government Hispanic Network or the National Forum for Black Public Administrators, the ability to see others and to share their experiences is something that ICMA very much supports with these organizations. And I know with the growth of INAPA in the last year or so, and the fact that there are a lot of younger administrators and early career folks in INAPA, the work that all of you are doing to support your colleagues of Asian American background is so important. So thank you for being here and helping to provide understanding to all of you who have joined us this morning. And thank you for listening. And I noticed that in the chat, there was a lot of discussion going on, as well as the conversation that we were having. So thank you all for participating actively. Have a great day.